When Claire Hayes inherited her late father's rusted old ambulance, she thought she'd been left with nothing but scrap metal. But hidden beneath the stretcher was a secret compartment filled with journals, cash, and a side of her father she never knew existed. And the deeper she dug, the more she realized the man she buried may have spent 20 years saving lives in complete silence. Before we continue, if stories like this hit you in the heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel with someone who needs a little hope today. It really helps more people find these stories, and honestly, I'm just glad you're here listening. And now I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Claire Hayes hadn't stepped inside her father's ambulance since the funeral. Honestly, she'd been avoiding it on purpose. The thing was parked in a storage lot off Red 18, squeezed between a rusted fishing boat and an RV with 2 flat tires. And every single day it sat there was costing her money she didn't have. $12 a day didn't sound like much until your checking account dropped below $200 and your landlord started taping final notice letters to your apartment door. Her brother Ethan kept telling her to get rid of it. "It's scrap metal," he'd said the morning after they buried their father. "Dad bought that thing for $400 from the county 20 years ago. Nobody wants it." He tossed the keys across the kitchen counter like he was handing her a dead flashlight instead of the last thing their father touched every day of his life. The rest of the estate had disappeared fast, too fast. Ethan sold the house within a week. Their father's recliner was gone before Claire even figured out where the spare obituary copies were kept. The garage tools got pawned off to some guy outside Lexington. Their mother's china cabinet went to Ethan's wife before Claire had a chance to say a word about it. Everything became numbers and paperwork and signatures. And through all of it, Claire mostly stayed quiet. Because grief was only part of what was wrong with her. The truth was she hadn't really been living for almost a year. 7 months earlier, she'd been working the overnight shift at Mercy General when a 17-year-old kid came in after an overdose. By the time they got him stabilized, his oxygen levels had already crashed. Claire still remembered the sound of the monitor flatlining. Still remembered the mother screaming in the hallway. Still remembered standing there afterward with blood on her gloves, while one of the doctors quietly said, "There's nothing else we can do." After that night, something inside her shut down. She stopped answering calls from coworkers, stopped wearing scrubs, stopped renewing the tiny parts of herself that made her feel useful. Most days she slept until noon and told people she was taking time off, which sounded healthier than admitting she couldn't walk into a hospital without feeling like she might throw up. So when Saturday morning came, cold and gray and smelling faintly like rain, Claire drove to the storage lot planning to empty the ambulance and call the scrapyard before noon. That was it. One last chore before she could finally stop thinking about her father. The ambulance looked even worse up close. The white paint had faded almost yellow in places, and rust crawled along the wheel wells like dried blood. One of the emergency lights on top was cracked clean through. The side mirror hung together with silver duct tape wrapped so many times it looked mummified. Claire stood there staring at it for a long moment with her hands shoved into her coat pockets. Then she unlocked the back doors. The smell hit her immediately. Old Von antiseptic dust. And underneath all of it, something painfully familiar. Her father. Walter Hayes had spent 32 years working county EMS. He was the kind of man who came home exhausted but never complained about it. Same breakfast every morning, same faded thermos, same boots by the front door. Growing up, Claire used to think he looked indestructible in his uniform. Bigger somehow. But after her mother died, he got quieter. Smaller, like life had slowly started folding him inward. Claire climbed into the back of the ambulance and sat on the side bench. It was cleaner than she expected. Not spotless, just maintained. The cabinets had been wiped down recently. The oxygen tank straps looked new. Even the floor had been swept. Somebody had cared about this vehicle right up until the end. Her father. A knot tightened in her chest. She started opening cabinets, mostly looking for anything worth selling. Old trauma shears gauze. Expired saline. Nothing important. Then she noticed the stretcher rail. At first it didn't fully register. Just something odd about the metal brackets underneath. Heavier than standard mounts. Extra bolts welded into the floor. Claire frowned. She'd spent years around ambulances. Enough to know what factory hardware looked like. This wasn't factory hardware. She knelt down slowly and ran her fingers along the edge of the platform until she felt it. A seam. Tiny, almost invisible beneath layers of paint. Her heartbeat picked up. There was a small latch tucked against the wall, painted the exact same color as the floor. "What the hell?" she muttered. The latch resisted at first before finally giving with a metallic click. A section of the floor lifted upward on hidden hinges. Claire froze. Underneath the stretcher platform was a steel compartment welded directly into the chassis. Not big, maybe 2 feet wide, but deep enough to hide things carefully. And someone had. Inside sat 3 worn journals bound in cracked leather. A bundle of envelopes tied together with a rubber band. A faded green savings passbook, a box of old prescription bottles. And resting on top of everything else was a white envelope with her name written across the front in her father's handwriting. Claire. Just seeing it nearly broke her. She sat back hard against the bench seat, staring at the compartment while cold wind drifted through the open ambulance doors behind her. For a second she couldn't breathe. Because suddenly the ambulance didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt hidden. Protected. Like her father had spent years building this secret space, knowing someday someone would find it. Knowing someday she would. Claire picked up the envelope carefully. Her father's handwriting looked shakier than she remembered. The last few months of his life had been rough. Congestive heart failure. Tremors in his hands. Shortness of breath he constantly lied about. Still, the letters were unmistakably his. She slid one finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a folded handwritten note. The first line read, "If you found this, it means you came back before giving up completely." Claire stared at the words, then read them again slower. Outside, somewhere across the storage lot, a truck engine started up. Tires crunched gravel, a dog barked in the distance. But inside the ambulance, the world had gone completely still. And for the first time in nearly a year, Claire felt something stronger than numbness. She felt curious. Claire stayed inside the ambulance for almost an hour after opening the hidden compartment. At some point the cold started creeping through her coat, but she barely noticed. The storage lot around her kept moving like normal engines starting, gravel crunching under tires, somebody arguing loudly near the front gate, but inside the ambulance it felt strangely sealed off from the world, like she'd stepped into a version of her father's life nobody else had ever been allowed to see. The journals sat open across the stretcher platform. At first she thought they were personal diaries, maybe old memories, stories from his years. They weren't. They were records. Detail organized, dated. Every page documented another person her father had treated outside the system. October 12th, male, approximately 50, found sleeping beneath Route 9 overpass. Severe infection, left leg cleaned wound. Repacked dressing, needs antibiotics soon or he'll lose the foot. January 4th, young female at church basement shelter, 6 months pregnant, blood pressure dangerously high. Refused hospital because she has no insurance. March 17th, boy at Miller camp with fever and wheezing. Mother afraid to call ambulance because of immigration status. Left inhaler samples, return Friday. Claire flipped through pages faster and faster. There were hundreds of entries. Some short, several pages long. Notes about symptoms, medications, follow-ups, weather conditions, directions to campsites and abandoned motels. Her father had built his own underground medical network, and nobody knew. Claire stopped on one entry near the middle of the second journal. June 8th, drove out to East Creek Trailer Park after shift. Woman named Teresa called church hotline about husband detoxing alone. Found patient hallucinating and dehydrated, stayed 4 hours until symptoms stabilized. Left Gatorade, crackers, blankets. She cried when I tried to leave, said nobody ever stays. Claire swallowed hard. That line hit her harder than she expected. Nobody ever stays. For months after the overdose case, Claire had been disappearing from everybody. Friends stopped checking in because she stopped answering. Coworkers eventually gave up texting. Even her father had started sounding careful around her on the phone, like he was trying not to push too hard. And now here she was reading proof that while she'd been shutting herself away, Walter Hayes had spent his final years driving around forgotten parts of the county, making sure strangers didn't have to suffer alone. She picked up another journal. The leather cover cracked softly in her hands. This one was older, maybe 15 years old. The handwriting was steadier back then. September 2nd. Construction worker at Franklin site. Deep forearm laceration from sheet metal. Stitched in back at ambulance because he begged me not to send him to air. Said he'd lose the job if they reported it. Gave antibiotics. Need to check for infection Thursday. Another entry. December 19th, woman sleeping in church parking lot with 2 children. Youngest has ear infection and fever. Couldn't afford urgent care. Left meds under front seat because mother was embarrassed to take charity face to face. Claire leaned back against the wall of the ambulance and closed her eyes for a second. Suddenly memories started rearranging themselves in her head. All those nights her father came home late smelling like gasoline and winter air. All those Tuesdays and Thursdays he disappeared for extra maintenance work. All the random medical supplies she remembered seeing around the garage growing up. The old cooler full of sample medications. The stacks of blankets in the basement. It had all meant something, and somehow nobody saw it. Or maybe nobody looked closely enough. Claire reached for the green savings passbook next. The account balance made her blink twice. $48,000. Not rich, but far more money than her father should have had sitting untouched, especially not a county paramedic making modest paychecks his whole life. She flipped through the deposit history. Small amounts. $50 here, $100 there, consistent quiet, over nearly 20 years. Her father had been building something slowly and deliberately for a very long time. Then she found the property documents. A commercial building on the east side of town. Paid off. Owned through a trust. Claire frowned. She didn't recognize the address at all. Tucked behind the deed was another folded piece of paper in Walter's handwriting. Plumbing mostly done. Electrical permits approved. Need exam room walls finished before winter. Her stomach tightened. Exam rooms. Not storage units, not offices. A clinic. Oh my God, she whispered out loud. She suddenly understood why Ethan never knew any of this existed. Because Walter hadn't hidden it from the world. He'd hidden it specifically from people who would, if you talked him out of it. People like Ethan. Her brother believed every problem in life could be solved with practicalibers, logic, profit margins. Even after their father died, Ethan talked more about closing accounts than losing a parent. Claire used to think that made him cold. Now she wondered if it was just easier than feeling things deeply. She looked back down at the journals. One loose photograph slipped free from between the pages and landed near her boot. It showed her father standing beside the ambulance sometime years earlier, younger. Healthier. One hand holding a coffee cup, the other resting on the open rear door. And beside him stood a little girl maybe 8 years old holding a stuffed rabbit while grinning at the camera. Claire didn't recognize her. But Walter looked proud, not dramatic, not heroic. Just quietly happy. The kind of happy people get when they know they're exactly where they're supposed to be. Claire stared at the photo for a long time. Then she opened the final journal. This one felt different immediately. The handwriting shook more. Some words drifted unevenly across the page. The entries were shorter, too, like writing had become physically harder for him near the end. April 3rd, chest pain worse today, didn't tell Claire. She already sounds tired every time we talk. Maylen skipped wrote tonight, legs swelling again. June loose fixed alternator for free. Tried paying him anyway. Then near the back, she found an entry with her name. No patient notes, no medical details. Just her. Claire called tonight after midnight. Said she couldn't sleep. I could hear something broken in her voice, even though she kept saying she was fine. Same tone Julia had during chemo whenever she didn't want me worrying. Claire thinks one bad night means she stopped being a nurse. Truth is, anybody can do the job on good days. The hard part is staying after the bad ones. Claire's vision blurred instantly. She pressed her thumb hard against the page. Her father knew. Not the details maybe, but enough. Enough to hear the shame hiding underneath her silence. And instead of confronting her, instead of giving speeches or trying to fix her, he'd spent years building something quietly in the background. A place for her to come back to whenever she was ready. Claire covered her mouth with one hand and cried right there in the back of the ambulance. Not neatly either. It came out ugly, heavy, months of guilt cracking open all at once. Because she suddenly realized something terrible. Her father understood her pain better than anyone alive, and she never once asked about his. After a while, Claire wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat and looked around the ambulance again. The old cabinets. The faded straps. The worn floor beneath her boots. This wasn't scrap metal. It was a map. And for the first time since the overdose case, Claire felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in nearly a year. Not happiness. Not hope exactly. But movement. Like some frozen part of her had finally started thawing. Claire drove across town the next morning with her father's journals stacked on the passenger seat beside her. She barely slept the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she kept seeing Walter sitting alone in that ambulance writing patient notes under parking lot lights, while the rest of the family went on living like nothing unusual was happening. The address from the property documents led her to the east side of Millhaven, past the old tire shops and boarded up laundromats where half the storefronts looked one missed payment away from disappearing completely. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood people invested money in anymore. Most businesses there either repaired things or sold things cheap. The building sat halfway down the block between an abandoned pawn shop and a small auto garage with faded signs in the windows. At first glance it looked dead. Old brick exterior. Dusty windows covered from the inside with plywood. Cracks running through parts of the parking lot. But when Claire parked and stepped out of the car, she noticed something strange. The sidewalk had been swept recently. Not perfectly, just enough to tell someone still came here. She walked toward the front door slowly, fishing through the ring of keys she'd found inside the hidden compartment. The third key slid into the deadbolt smoothly. For a second, she just stood there staring at the handle. Then she opened the door. The smell inside hit her first. Sawdust, paint, drywall, dust. Not abandoned. Unfinished. Sunlight leaked through thin gaps around the plywood covering the windows, cutting pale stripes across the concrete floor. The place was bigger than she expected. A reception counter sat half-built near the entrance, still missing cabinet doors. Framed walls divided the space into several small rooms. Electrical wiring hung loose near the ceiling in places, and near the back wall sat stacked boxes labeled exam gloves, gauze, alcohol pads. Claire walked deeper into the building in complete silence. Everywhere she looked, she saw pieces of her father. Not emotionally. Practically. The measurements written directly onto studs in black marker. The handwritten supply lists taped beside outlets. Coffee stains on folded permit paperwork sitting near the sink installation plans. Walter had built this place the same way he lived his entire life, quietly, patiently, one piece at a time. Claire reached down and picked up a clipboard resting on the counter. At the top was a checklist written in her father's handwriting. Finish plumbing. Order waiting room chairs. Check free vaccine program with county office. Talk to Claire when the time is right. Her throat tightened instantly. Hell, she whispered softly. You must be Walter's girl. The voice startled her hard enough she nearly dropped the clipboard. Claire turned around fast. An older man stood near the open doorway holding a travel mug and wiping Grace from his hands with a shop rag. Mid-60s maybe. Heavy work jacket, weathered face. He nodded toward the ambulance key ring in her hand. I'm guessing you re Claire. She stared at him cautiously for a second before nodding. Who are you? Louis Moreno. He pointed across the street toward the garage with the faded windows. I own the shop over there. Claire relaxed slightly. You knew my dad? Louis gave a quiet laugh. Knew him. Your father practically lived on this block. That sentence landed strangely, because until 48 hours ago, Claire would be sworn her father spent his days either at work or home watching baseball in his recliner. Louis walked slowly into the building beside her. Walter used to park that ambulance right outside every Thursday night. Been doing it for years. Claire looked around again. Why didn't anybody know about this? Louis shrugged. Your father wasn't interested in being known. He said it matter-of-factly, not admiring or criticizing it. Just true. Louis walked over to the framed exam room wall and tapped one of the studs lightly. I helped him build most of this. You did. Plumbing too. Electrical guy comes by weekends sometimes. Couple church volunteers painted the back rooms last winter. Claire blinked at him. Wait, multiple people knew about this. Oh yeah, Louis said, a lot of people did. Claire suddenly felt embarrassed. Not because her father kept secrets. Because apparently she was one of the few people who never noticed who he really was. Louis leaned against the unfinished reception desk and studied her carefully. You okay? Claire almost lied automatically, then stopped herself. Not really. Louis nodded like he expected that answer. Yeah. Walter mentioned that sometimes. Her head lifted. He talked about me. Only good things. Louis smiled faintly. Said you were stubborn as hell and too hard on yourself. Claire looked away before the emotion could fully hit her face. Louis changed the subject gently. Come on, there's somebody else you should meet. He led her across the street toward a small brick church tucked between two apartment buildings. The basement doors were open, and voices drifted up from downstairs along with the smell of coffee and soup. The room below looked like a community pantry, folding tables, canned food stacked against walls, volunteers sorting donated clothes. And near the back stood an older black woman wearing reading glasses on a chain around her neck while organizing boxes with military precision. Louis smiled. "Marlene, this is Walter's daughter." The woman stopped moving immediately. For one long second, she just stared at Claire. Then her entire face softened. "Oh, honey," she said quietly. "I've been wondering when you'd show up." Her name was Marlene Brooks, and within 10 minutes Claire realized this woman knew more about her father than she did. Walter had spent nearly every Tuesday night in this church basement running free checkups for anyone who needed them. Blood pressure screenings, infection care, breathing treatments, medication referrals. No insurance questions, Marlene said. That was his rule. Claire sat at one of the folding tables listening, while people drifted in and out of the pantry around them. He treated half this neighborhood at one point or another, Marlene continued. Sometimes folks came in for food and stayed because Walter noticed they were sick. Louis chuckled softly. Men could spot pneumonia from across a parking lot. Claire found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. Not because any of this was funny, because hearing strangers talk about her father made him feel alive again somehow. Then more people started recognizing her. A woman carrying groceries stopped dead in the middle of the room. "Wait, you re Walter's daughter." Claire nodded awkwardly. The woman immediately walked over. "Your dad sat with my husband through alcohol withdrawals for 2 straight nights because I was too scared to do it alone." An older man nearby overheard and joined in. "Walter drove me to county rehab 3 times before it finally stuck." Then another voice from the back. "He fixed my kid's arm after a bike crash." Another. "He brought groceries after my surgery." Another. "He never made you feel poor." That one stayed with Claire. He never made you feel poor. Not weak. Not embarrassing. Not broken. Just human. For months Claire had viewed herself as damaged beyond repair. A nurse who froze, a daughter who drifted away, a woman barely holding her own life together. But sitting in that church basement hearing story after story about Walter quietly showing up for people on their worst days, something inside her started shifting. Not healed. Not even close. But moving. Then her phone rang. Ethan. Claire stepped outside into the cold afternoon air before answering. "I found property tax notices in Dad's forwarded mail," he said immediately. "No hello. You want to explain why Dad secretly owned commercial property?" Claire leaned against the brick wall. "It's a clinic." "A what?" "A free clinic." Silence. Then Ethan laughed once, short, sharp, disbelieving. "Claire, come on. I'm serious. You were telling me Dad secretly built a charity clinic while pretending to be broke." "Yes. That doesn't even make sense." Claire looked through the church basement window, where volunteers moved around carrying boxes, while Louis laughed about something near the coffee station. For the first time, she realized the problem wasn't that the story made no sense. It was that Ethan never understood the kind of man their father actually was. "He spent 20 years helping people," Claire said quietly. Ethan's voice hardened, and he hid all of it from his own family. Claire looked down at the journals tucked under her arm. "No," she said softly. "I think he hid it from people who would-be tried to stop him." The letter from Ethan's attorney arrived 3 days later. Claire found it taped halfway out of her apartment mailbox when she came home carrying grocery bags and a box of donated medical supplies from the church pantry. At first she thought it was another late notice bill until she saw the law firm's stamp across the front. She already knew before opening it that it wouldn't be good. Ethan was officially contesting the trust. According to the filing, Walter Hayes had demonstrated erratic financial behavior, secrecy, and impaired judgment during the final years of his life. The attorney argued that the hidden bank account, undisclosed property, and unauthorized spending raised serious concerns about his mental state before death. Claire read the letter twice, standing in the apartment hallway, then a third time slower. By the end, her hands were shaking. Not because she thought Ethan would win. Because reducing her father's entire life to legal phrases on expensive paper suddenly made her furious in a way grief hadn't yet managed to. Erratic financial behavior. That's what they called 20 years of quietly helping people stay alive. Claire drove straight to the clinic building after that. Luce was inside replacing part of the plumbing beneath the sink installation when she walked in. The smell of sawdust and fresh paint filled the room now. The place looked different every day lately, more alive. He took one look at her face and immediately set his wrench down. What happened? Claire handed him the letter. Louis skimmed it silently, jaw tightening more with every line. Finally he let out a long breath through his nose. That boy really doesn't know who his father was. He thinks Dad lost his mind, Claire said quietly. Louis folded the letter carefully and handed it back. No, he thinks this doesn't fit the version of your dad he created in his head. That landed harder than Claire expected, because deep down she understood exactly what he meant. Ethan had spent his whole life believing Walter cared more about strangers than his own family. Every missed birthday dinner, every late-night emergency call, every canceled weekend trip because somebody somewhere needed help. To Ethan, this clinic probably looked like proof. Claire leaned against the unfinished reception desk and rubbed her eyes. Part of me understands why he's angry. Louis nodded slowly. Yeah, doesn't mean he's right. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning at County Probate Court. Nothing dramatic, no jury. Just a judge reviewing whether the trust should remain protected or reopened for estate claims. Still, word somehow spread fast through the community. Probably Marlene. By Sunday afternoon, people had already started showing up at the clinic carrying folders, paperwork, photographs, handwritten statements. Claire stood frozen near the doorway while an older woman she barely knew handed her a sealed envelope. What's this? Your father paid for my insulin one winter after my husband got laid off, the woman said. That letter explains it better than I can. Another man brought copies of text messages from Walter arranging rides to dialysis appointments. A former addict named Robbie showed up carrying a 6-month sobriety chip in his pocket. Your dad sat outside detox with me for 8 straight hours because I kept trying to leave. Claire didn't know what to say to any of them. Every conversation felt like discovering another hidden room inside her father's life. And somehow each story hurt and healed her at the same time. The night before the hearing, Claire stayed late at the clinic alone organizing paperwork. Rain hammered softly against the windows while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The building still wasn't finished. Half the cabinets remained empty. One exam room didn't even have flooring installed yet. But for the first time, Claire could finally picture what the place might become someday. She opened the final journal again around midnight. Her father's handwriting drifted shakily across the page near the end. Some people think helping others means you have endless strength. Truth is, most days you do it tired, grieving, angry, scared. You do it anyway. Claire stared at the words for a long time, then quietly closed the journal and went home. The courthouse smelled like wet coats and old coffee the next morning. Claire almost turned around twice before walking inside. She hated courtrooms. Too sterile, too tense, too much waiting around while strangers picked apart private pain. Ethan was already there when she entered, gray suit, arms crossed, looking exhausted. For a second, seeing him like that made Claire remember they were both grieving the same man, just differently. Then Ethan's attorney walked over carrying 2 thick folders, and the feeling disappeared. The hearing room itself was small. No dramatic wood paneling. No packed audience like television courtrooms. But when Claire turned around after sitting down, she realized nearly every seat behind her was filled. Marlene sat in the second row wearing church clothes and holding a folder against her chest. Louis stood near the back wall in a clean mechanic shirt. Robbie was there too. So was the mother whose son Walter treated for asthma, and the elderly diabetic woman, and a construction worker Claire recognized from Louis's garage. People kept filing in quietly until almost every seat was occupied. Ethan noticed too. Claire saw confusion flicker across his face for the first time. His attorney began by outlining the challenge calmly and professionally. Undisclosed assets. Secretive financial behavior. Unauthorized medical activity. Questionable judgment near end of life. The words sounded colder spoken aloud somehow. Then the attorney representing Walter's trust stood up. She was an older woman named Denise Carter who had apparently worked with Walter for years. She placed a thick stack of documents onto the table. Medical evaluations showing Walter remained mentally competent until death. Signed trust reviews spanning 7 years. Financial records proving consistent planning and organized expenditures. Volunteer statements. Maintenance records. Building permits. Every detail meticulously documented. Mr. Hayes demonstrated long-term intentional planning, Denai said firmly, not confusion. Then the judge surprised everyone by allowing limited public statements from community witnesses. And suddenly the room changed completely. Because facts were one thing, stories were another. Marlene spoke first. She stood slowly, hands folded in front of her, and described Walter treating families inside the church basement for nearly 2 decades. He never asked who could pay, she said quietly. He only asked who needed help. Lewis spoke next. He described Walter working overnight shifts before spending his free days repairing the clinic building by hand. He knew exactly what he was building, Lewis said, and exactly who he was building it for. Then Robbie stood, nervous, sweating slightly. I was an addict, he said bluntly. Most people looked at me like I was already dead. Walter didn't. The room went silent. He sat with me through withdrawals because he said nobody should detox alone if they can help it. One by one people kept standing. A mother, a veteran, a teenager, an old man whose leg infection Walter treated for months beneath a highway overpass because he was too ashamed to seek hospital care. Nobody talked about money. Nobody talked about legal technicalities. They talked about a man who showed up when everyone else walked away. Claire glanced at Ethan during one of the statements. For the first time since all of this started, he wasn't angry. He looked lost. Like someone slowly realizing there had been an entire second version of his father living parallel to the one he knew. By the time the judge dismissed the challenge, the room felt emotionally exhausted. The trust remained protected. The clinic legally belonged to Claire, just like Walter intended. Outside the courthouse, rain had finally stopped. People gathered near the courthouse steps talking quietly before drifting away one by one. Marlene hugged Claire tightly before leaving. Lewis squeezed her shoulder. You okay? Claire nodded weakly. I think so. But honestly she wasn't sure what she felt. Relief maybe. Grief still. Something heavier too. Ethan stood alone near the parking lot staring at the ground beside his SUV. Claire hesitated before walking toward him. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then Ethan finally said quietly, I didn't know any of that. Claire looked at him carefully. I know. He laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. All those people, all those years. His voice cracked slightly before he caught it. I thought he just liked being needed more than being home. Claire swallowed hard, because that sentence sounded painfully honest, not cruel. Just old enough to shape a life around. He loved us, she said softly. Ethan stared across the parking lot for a long moment, then finally nodded once. But he still looked unconvinced, or maybe just ashamed. Before getting into his SUV, he turned back toward her. I don't know what to do with any of this yet, he admitted. Claire looked past him toward the cloudy sky above the courthouse. Yeah, she said quietly. Me neither. 3 months later, the clinic finally opened. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. But it opened. The old brick building on the east side of Millhaven barely resembled the abandoned shell Claire first walked into after finding the hidden documents in the ambulance. The plywood had come off the windows, fresh paint covered the walls. The reception desk Louis built by hand stretched across the front waiting area, sanded smooth and stained dark walnut. The exam rooms were small but clean, functional, real. Above the entrance hung a simple sign, Hayes Community Clinic. Walk-ins welcome. No one turned away. Claire stood outside staring at it the morning they installed it. Coffee cooling in her hands while traffic rolled past on the street behind her. For a long moment she imagined her father standing beside her looking up at the sign with that quiet expression he always wore whenever he fixed something around the house correctly on the first try. Not pride exactly, more like peace. The clinic came together because people refused to let Walter's work die with him. Louis practically lived there during renovations. He rebuilt plumbing lines after working 10-hour shifts at the garage. Marlene organized donations so aggressively that half the county probably thought she'd started running a political campaign. Church volunteers brought folding chairs, lamps, coffee makers, old filing cabinets. Even people Claire had never met started showing up with supplies. A retired pediatric nurse donated pediatric thermometers and children's books for the waiting room corner. Someone dropped off 2 barely used wheelchairs anonymously overnight. Another local business owner paid for the clinic's first 6 months of utility bills without leaving a name. The strangest part was how naturally everybody spoke about helping. Nobody treated the clinic like charity. They treated it like continuing something that already belonged to the community. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Claire became part of it too. Not immediately. The first few weeks were rough. Some mornings she sat in her car outside the building gripping the steering wheel so hard her fingers hurt, because walking back into a medical environment still triggered panic deep in her chest. Certain sounds made her stomach tighten instantly, oxygen tanks opening, monitor alarms, even the smell of rubbing alcohol some days. But every time she wanted to leave, she remembered the journals. Remembered her father driving around exhausted and grieving and still choosing to show up. So she kept showing up too. One afternoon while organizing supply cabinets, Claire found her old nursing license buried beneath unopened mail inside her apartment drawer. The expiration date was approaching fast. She stared at it for almost 10 minutes before finally sitting down at the kitchen table and beginning the renewal paperwork. The recertification exam terrified her more than she expected. Not because of the material, because passing meant admitting she might still belong in medicine after all. The morning of the test, Claire nearly turned the car around twice. But she passed. Barely. And when the new license arrived in the mail 2 weeks later, she carried it into the clinic and stood staring at it in silence before finally hanging it behind the reception desk. Louis noticed immediately. "Well," he said softly from across the room, "looks official now." Claire smiled before she could stop herself. By opening week, the clinic still had problems. One exam room light flickered occasionally. The coffee machine leaked. Half the waiting room chairs didn't match. But none of that mattered Monday morning when people started arriving before the doors even officially opened. An older couple came first carrying homemade muffins wrapped in foil. Then a mother with 2 kids needing school physical forms. Then a construction worker Louis knew from the garage who needed stitches removed but didn't have insurance. By noon, every chair in the waiting room was full. Claire moved through the day in a blur of paperwork, blood pressure checks, prescription forms, and introductions. Some moments still felt surreal. Every few minutes somebody mentioned her father. "Walter treated my nephew once. Your dad drove my husband to rehab. He sat with my sister during chemo appointments." At one point Claire stepped into the supply closet just to breathe for a second because hearing his name over and over all day felt both comforting and painful in ways she couldn't fully explain. The hardest moment came near closing time. A woman walked into the clinic carrying a little boy maybe 3 years old against her shoulder. The kid's cheeks were flushed red with fever, his tiny hands gripping weakly at his mother's sweatshirt. The woman looked exhausted. Not dramatic movie exhausted. Real exhausted. The kind that settles into someone after too many nights without enough sleep or money or help. "I'm sorry," she said immediately when she approached the desk. "I know you're probably closing soon." Claire shook her head automatically. "What's going on?" "He's had a fever since yesterday. I tried urgent care but they wanted payment up front." Claire gently took the thermometer and crouched beside the little boy. "102." As she lifted the stethoscope from the counter, the little boy started crying weakly and turned his face into his mother's shoulder. And suddenly Claire froze. Not physically at first. Internally. The memory hit hard and fast. Hospital monitors screaming. The overdose patient gasping for air. The doctor saying there's nothing else we can do. For one horrible second, Claire felt herself slipping backward into that room again. Her pulse spiked instantly. Hands shaking. Breathing shallow. The mother noticed too. "Are you okay?" Claire couldn't answer right away. Through the clinic window behind them, she could see the ambulance parked beneath the streetlight outside. Old, rust-dented. Still there. Then another memory surfaced quietly underneath the panic. Her father's handwriting in the journal. "The hard part is staying after the bad ones." Claire swallowed hard, then took a slow breath, and stayed. She listened carefully to the child's lungs, clear, no crackling, no wheezing. She checked his throat, ears, hydration level. Viral fever. Manageable. Treatable. The mother looked close to tears while Claire explained medication instructions and warning signs to watch overnight. "How much do I owe you?" she asked softly. Claire glanced around the clinic for a second. At the exam room walls her father planned. At the donated supplies. At the faded ambulance outside. Then she smiled gently. "Nothing," she said. "You're okay, that's why we here." The woman actually started crying then. Not loudly. just quietly enough that Claire realized how long it had probably been since somebody made her life easier instead of harder. After they left, the clinic finally emptied out. Luce locked the front door while Marlene wiped down counters in the waiting room. Somebody turned off the radio near the reception desk. The building settled into evening silence. Claire stepped outside alone for some air. Summer heat still lingered in the pavement. Traffic hummed softly down the street. The ambulance sat parked near the curb beneath the glow of a street lamp. She walked over and rested one hand against the faded paint. "So this is what you were building," she murmured quietly. "Not a business. Not a legacy. A place people could walk into without feeling ashamed for needing help." Claire stood there for a long moment before hearing footsteps behind her. She turned. Across the parking lot stood Ethan. No suit this time, no lawyer. Just jeans, work boots, and an envelope in his hand. For a second neither of them spoke. Then Ethan walked forward slowly and held out the envelope. "What's this?" Claire asked carefully. "My share from selling the house," he said quietly. "Or part of it." Claire opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a check made out to Hayes Community Clinic. $12,000? She looked back up at him, stunned. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets awkwardly. "I kept thinking about all those people from court. All those stories." He looked down briefly before continuing. "I spent most of my life thinking Dad cared more about strangers than us." Claire stayed silent. Ethan laughed softly, but there was pain underneath it. Turns out helping strangers was probably the way he loved people. The sentence hung between them in the warm night air. Then Ethan nodded once toward the clinic. "You were doing something good here, Claire." For the first time in months, she believed that might actually be true. "I think the reason stories like this stay with people isn't because of the big emotional moments. It's because deep down, most of us know what it feels like to carry pain quietly while pretending we refine." Claire thought one terrible night defined the rest of her life. She believed failing once meant she no longer deserved to help anyone ever again. And honestly, I think a lot of people do that to themselves. Maybe not in hospitals or ambulances, but in everyday life. One mistake, one loss, one season where we fall apart a little. And suddenly we start believing we were broken beyond repair. But what Walter understood and what Claire slowly learned is that being human was never about getting through life without scars. It's about what you do after the scars happen. Some people shut down. Some people become bitter. Some people spend years hiding from the parts of themselves that hurt. But other people keep showing up anyway, tired, imperfect, still grieving, still carrying guilt, and somehow still choosing kindness. That's the part of this story that hit me the hardest. Walter never became rich. Most people in town barely noticed him while he was alive. He drove an old ambulance that looked like junk and spent years helping people who had nothing to offer him in return. But in the end, when everything was over, what remained wasn't money or property. It was people. Real people whose lives were different because one man decided they mattered. And I think there's something powerful about that. Because we live in a world that constantly measures success by visibility, followers, recognition, status. But this story reminds us that some of the most meaningful lives are lived quietly. Sometimes the people changing the world the most are doing it in small rooms nobody sees, helping people who may never be able to repay them. And maybe the biggest lesson of all is this: you do not have to be fully healed before you can still do good in the world. Claire didn't magically become fearless. She didn't suddenly forget the patient she lost. The pain never disappeared completely. But she stopped letting pain convince her that her life was over. She learned that healing isn't about becoming the person you were before the bad thing happened. Sometimes healing is simply deciding to stay instead of running away. To keep showing up, to keep the door open, even after life gives you every reason to close it.